Hello, everyone. How's the voice and the sound back there? Good? Good. Well, welcome. Welcome to this grand and, I think, magnificent space, persons, and poetry gathered in honor of Gary Whited's new book. I have actually a formal set of remarks that I want to present. So will you bear with me as I actually read and turn pages, and maybe I'll find a spot somewhere in this for a joke. That was it. Let me begin these proceedings by invoking one of several possible muses that I believe helped inspire the poetry we meet in Gary's Having Listened. I am thinking of William Stafford, the poet whose centennial is next year, 2014. He was born in Hutchinson, Kansas. He came of age during the Great Depression. He lived in a number of small towns all throughout the state. His father actually sold drill bits for the oil industry. He attended the University of Kansas up until the start of World War II. The plains and the prairie in Kansas were always, and I mean always, a part of Stafford's imagination. The far west in general also was. But it was hardly ever the west of the monumental. It was not the great rock formations nor the grand vistas that really interested him. It was usually more the story of a little quote from a poem. It was more the story of wide spaces lying out in the open huddle of brush, all the little lives. That's in a poem he wrote called Over in Montana. And when Stafford said little lives, what he meant was something more or less than matters of, social importance. It really had nothing to do with physical size. The little lives, he thought, were the all-important lives. They were the lives of flowers and bees and people coming of age and the family dramas that got lived out under the immensity of sun and wind and sky. So too with Gary Whited's poems. I don't want to overstate the Stafford connection, but I think it's crucially important to note how a writer who comes before you can open up a terrain that at first looked as if it didn't qualify for poetry. It was not sublime enough or poetic enough, or rather was simply unpoetic or anti-poetic. And when some of that unpoetic terrain gets opened, it helps the poet starting off in a real way. It helps one to credit his or her own experience, his or her own landscape or place, his or her own imaginative grappling with the ostensibly unpoetic, which of course is everywhere. Seamus Heaney once wrote that in thinking about how you invent your own distinctive voice in writing, you begin by first hearing it in the poetry of others or the writing of others. You hear a note that speaks deeply to you, and what Heaney says is what you're picking up on is a sign of some hidden part of yourself that you may not have known of other than through that other writer. I think that might be how Bill Stafford functioned as an inspiration for Gary's poems. In this book, Gary's poems, of course, are not in Kansas, but are literally over in Montana. They're on the farm and ranch where his parents raised him. This is where, for instance, he met the fence posts that became shamanic objects in his poetry, the markers that douse the land and for signals from within the self or within existence, perhaps more broadly. They teach him, those fence posts, how to listen, how to stand still, and even more still, so that we might know or learn how to be in the presence of the stark reality of being. The fence post in Gary's poetry, I would tell you, and if those who've read the book will know this, it knew his cheek, it knew his listening, it knew the sunrise, the sunset, the cows, the meadowlark, and the hawk. And it knew the grief in the earth and in the lives of those around it. Gary's fence posts remind me of another Staffordian dimension. In a poem recounting how he first met his muse, Stafford said that the muse was one's own way of looking at things. It sounds simple, But in our over-mediated society, all of us drowning in images that vie for our attention, each of them trying to help us buy something or like something, our individual way of seeing things and the words for it become harder and harder to come by. But you can read in the poems of this book an ongoing, lifelong effort on Gary's part to see things in his own way. A prime example is in this poetry is the way in which he is in an ongoing dialogue with the pre-Socratic philosopher Parmenides. We all recognize that is Gary's own way of seeing things. As many of you know, Gary is a philosopher as well as a poet and a therapist. And as a young philosopher, he translated On Nature, the fragments of Parmenides, as part of our degree project, I believe. I will not venture very far into Parmenides' philosophical thought, believe me. But I will defer instead to Gary, who tells us in one poem that, quote, travel to the other world was possible, according to Parmenides. And then he follows that premise with his exquisite couplet. Horses could take you there. So quiet, the way Spike loped across the summer pasture. That is Gary Whitehead's own way of seeing things, his forging a connection between the philosophical and the actual, the surprising, almost miraculous actual. Spike, meet Parmenides. Parmenides, welcome to the prairie, to the corral, to the bunkhouse, to second-generation Norwegians, to manure, barns, clothespins. I would be remiss, however, if I did not remark upon what I think of as a peaceful quality to this poetry. It's not tranquility and it's not merely silence, so that's a major thing to say, not merely silence. But it's rather a non-aggressive, non-grasping, relational attitude underneath and motivating this art. In what I wrote on the back of the book, I called it an ongoing inquiry into the nature of listening. David Ferry, in another blurb in the back, says, not just listening, those poems go into all the ways in which we attend to and discern reality. David Ferry calls this trait in Gary's poems a respectful attention. Without corresponding with David about this, I call it a gathering and focusing of our attention on the order of prayer. Today, on this good day, I want to refract that dimension of Gary's poetry through another biographical prism, that of the William Joyner Center, now called Institute, that of the William Joyner Center for the Study of War and Social Consequences. In workshops there, I first met Gary and his poetry. And over these years, I have been privileged to watch his art unfold, evolve, and flower into this book. In the overall work and atmosphere of the Joyner Center, there is an ethos, neither an orthodoxy of thought nor of aesthetics, but rather a ground-level, tacit affirmation that whatever peaceful or peacemaking relation to the world might be, or how it might be in our lives, it has about it the quality, the careful quality of attention that Gary's poems so beautifully embody and enact. There are many ways to talk about this sort of attentiveness. One could indeed call it prayer. One could call it an empathic, imaginative practice. One could call it a faith in language and faith in this art that helps us, as Parmenides did say, travel to the other world. But I think the right name for this kind of attention that we find in Gary's poetry is love. So with that in mind, let us welcome into our reading world Gary Whitehead's poems.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me?
No.
A little mic? Oh, lift this up. Like that? Up there. Is that better?
Yes.
Thank you. Is that, you can, how about back there? You're hearing okay? Okay. So, thank Thank you, all of you, for coming here and jamming yourselves in here. It's really an honor to see you here, to have you here. I'm really moved. And so I hope I can speak to you without losing it. Yeah, so I want to say some more words of thanks to you, Fred, for everything, all these years, the years at the Joiner and before that, and all the other places we've met each other over poems, over coffee, over scotch, over tables, and all the ways you've inspired me and guided me, helped me see the tail of a poem that really didn't belong, or the head of a poem that needed trimming, and the painful cuts that led to something really delicious. But the one thing I want to thank you for is what you also referred to, is the way you returned me to Parmenides. In that workshop, when we had our one-on-one at the beginning of the 2-week session, somehow you asked something that made me tell you that I had translated Parmenides, and you said, why don't you show that to me? So I did. I brought you my copy of the translation of Parmenides that had been sitting on my shelf someplace for a long time, a few years, without much of my attention. And from then on, in the workshop, every morning we'd come to class, there'd be 1 or 2 little passages from Parmenides on the board. And I, of course, was quite honored, but also like puzzled. And Fred would invite us, if we wanted to write in response to these passages of Parmenides. And that was, for me, the beginning of going back to that piece of work and to my work on it from my early mid-20s when I translated it in my graduate work. And so now I'm so back to it. I'm doing a new version of the translation of my translation of Parmenides. I'm not doing a new version of Parmenides, just a new version of my translation. And that was really the beginning of my imagining that Parmenides had a place in this then manuscript that was very much in its beginning stages. So thank you for that, Fred. And another thing I want to say to you, Fred, is you recently told me of an essay you had just written in memory of Seamus Heaney. And in that essay you speak of your gratitude to Seamus Heaney. And at the end of that essay you quote a passage from Seamus Heaney in which he apparently was acknowledging someone, and his words were that he spoke to the special gratitude we reserve for those who have led us toward confidence in ourselves. So I extend that to you, Fred, on my behalf. Thank you. Thank you. So I want also to extend that gratitude to all of you here, to many of you who have sat with me in poetry groups, in workshops, at readings, at the Brookline Poetry Series, at the Jamaica Pond Poets, and many other places, and have listened and listened and listened, and commented and pruned and suggested, and helped me find my way to that confidence that actually has made this book possible. So many of you here, so many of you have your footprints, your fingerprints, and your ear listening prints all over this book. Thank you. Thank you. I want to also say thank you to my kids. And my granddaughter, who you hear over there. Hi, Ella. Hi, Ella. And Liam over here. And I always mistake you and call you Soren, who's back there. So I want to say thanks to Anna to Soren and to Jeremy, my son-in-law. Jeremy, by the way, is responsible for the sound system, so thank you, Jeremy, for plugging us in. And to Anna and Soren, I want to say a special thanks for having listened over and over and over to stories about my life on the prairie. And the telling you of those stories was the beginning of these poems coming into being, though not only did you not know that that's what was happening, I didn't know that either. But that's what was happening. I realize now as I look back that you're listening, and sometimes attentively, sometimes under duress. But thank you. Thank you guys for all of that. And I want to say thanks to Elizabeth from the Grolier Poetry Bookshop and to Grolier Poetry Bookshop for being here and for sponsoring this with us and being the Grolier Poetry Bookshop all this time. Thank you. Thank you. And the last thank you I want to say is to another Elizabeth, who is Elizabeth Slayton, in the midst of whose paintings we are sitting. So Elizabeth, this is the part that will get me, if anything will. I just want to say that Elizabeth and I have been together for 41 years now, and Elizabeth, go Ella! And Elizabeth has been painting for all of those 41 years. And one of the things that I feel like you and I have done, Elizabeth, is to accompany each other in bringing things into image and into voice. And you so many times would get to a place where you would say, I don't think I have any more paintings in me. And then you would start painting again. So this is the most recent harvest that we're sitting in. There have been many harvests, many bumper crops, I would say. That's, yeah, on the prairie, that's a good thing. And so I want to thank you for just keeping going and showing me how you keep going, which has helped me keep going. So thank you for that. I also want to thank you for almost always being the first listener to these poems. The person to whom I turn when I'm on my way out the door to the JP Poetry Group thinking, does this go? Will this fly? And Elizabeth will say, yeah, this is ready to live outside the house. Or to the Brookline Poetry Series, the same thing. So thank you for that. Yeah. I need water. So, some poems. Let me start with Parmenides, which seems appropriate. The passage from Fragment 8. Parmenides, by the way, is a 5th century BCE thinker. You probably all know that. But this is a passage from Fragment 8. This one has been like one of the fence posts for me. On this way are very many signs that being is birthless and indestructible, for it is whole-limbed and unmoved and without end. Not ever was it, or will it be, since it is now, all at once, one, continuous. And one more little passage from the Parmenides. This is Fragment 2, or part of Fragment 2, and this happens in the poem after the youth in the poem has been carried along the much renowned road by very wise horses to the gates of night and day. And once the goddess Dike, or Justice, is persuaded to open them both, the youth is brought through the gates of night and day where he meets the goddess. And this is what she says to him. Come then, I will tell you. And you, having heard the speech, give heed to it, and carry it safely home. Prairie. Wind sweeps across this picture. Meadowlark on barbed wire. Yellow-breasted door opens with its song. Weathered fence posts hold the wire. Below the ground, they slowly rot. Wind almost every place in this picture. Shirts on the clothesline, their sleeves ripple. The rattlesnake suns her long body on the scoria outcropping. Her skin flutters above her like worn flags. Magpie flickers through chokecherry bushes at the edge of the creek. The black fruit sweetens in the long light. Beneath the wind, do not forget the badger who digs alone into the sod and the silence, while high above, wind carries the rough-legged hawk on her long hunt over wheat fields that move in waves across the field, each stalk tossing its head like water. And as far as eye can see, the shadow of anything standing ripens twice each day. To fence post. It knew my breath and knew my cheek. It was yesterday, a long time ago, when I stood alone next to any old fence post and waited. Before I knew, I was beginning a practice of listening to what stands still a long time. Today, standing any place, that yearning might come for a way in to where fence posts stay without ceasing, each one a priest of stillness. Any day this is so. On a hillside where wind trembles the grass stands a quiet gray weathered post, crust of golden lichen glowing on the shadowed side. Here's the poem Fred quoted from. And there's one thing you need to know for this poem, and that is that the sharp-shinned is the name of a hawk, if you didn't already know that. Horses could take you there. If I could remember it, and the names of the horses. But I don't, until stuck in the traffic on the Jamaica way, and the red tail lands on a nearby limb. The horses' names start to come back. Goldie, Red, Lightning, Lucky, Blue, Babe, and Spike. The young sharp-shinned I killed at the creek back then, shooting BBs again and again. The young hawk perfectly still. Sound of my mother's accordion, the only thing that soothed. If I'd ever believed in a God, this would be the time to unfold it. Travel to the other world was possible, according to Parmenides. Horses could take you there. So quiet, the way Spike loped across the summer pasture. So, tell me if you run out of gas for listening. So, okay, thank you. So here's another little Parmenides passage. The Parmenides passages mark the beginnings of each section, and this will lead to the people of that place back there. Here's Parmenides. According to belief, these things were brought forth and now are. And afterwards, from this time, they will grow and perish. You are such a great audience. Thank you. So, some of the people. my father's trips to town. What a shy gentleman he was, in the field, working, in the church, silent, unwilling to sing, and in the bank, head bowed, bargaining with only the promise of harvest. Yet in the bar, loosened by liquor, laughing, dice shaking, dare taking beyond his reach. At last, returning home after dark, he walked alone, scolded, to the barn, to milk the burdened cow, who lashed him in his shame with her piss-wet tail as he sat, cursing, on the three-legged milking stool. So here's another picture of my father, and it's a prose poem. And this prose poem, please come in. Please come in. There are plenty of places. Please come in. So this prose poem is called Goldie in Red, and this is one of those stories I told Anna and Soren many, many times. And Anna actually wrote a children's book based on this story, a beautiful children's book, which I keep encouraging her to try to publish. So Anna, this one's for you. Goldie in Red. In the full of winter, my father would come past the house with the team and the hayrack on its large wooden sled runners, covered with iron so to wear longer, and I'd climb up with him, bundled in my layers of wool and overshoes, feeling thick within my own body. And we'd drive Goldie in Red to the field where the loaf-shaped haystacks had waited since July or August, to pitch the hay, forkful at a time, into the rack, to bring it home to the cows behind the barn in that pasture we fondly called the milk cow pasture. I'd watch his pitchfork work in dimensions beyond me, large forkfuls of hay rising as if some engine were lifting them, arcing from haystack to wagon rack, arriving in round bunches, heavy and silent. My own small three-tined fork offering only symbols of hay next to his volumes. We'd switch part way, front to back, so both ends of the rack would fill evenly, and my smallness would be swallowed in the heft of his work. Then homeward, precarious on the pile of hay, holding the reins in my mittened hands while he gets off to open gates. And I drive through, alone and mighty, atop this masterpiece of work, which I fancy is mine for a moment, as we pass out of sight of him closing the gate, until I try to stop the horses, whose bitted mouths do not feel my tugs, and they move as if I am not there, when suddenly his voice booms from behind, "Whoa, you sons of bitches, whoa!" And they stop as the reins go slack in my hands. So, some more of the people. Farm. My mother stood at her kitchen window, facing north and wringing her hands. Heavy like iron, that I thought I could unwind her gnarl of worry. When my father fixed fence along the creek, he expected supper. She unwound her worried hands to make it, a mix of potatoes, meat, and sorrow. My father ate everything except the sorrow. My brother and I divided it. He, being older, took the smaller share. Evening came. I walked to the barn to gather the cows, to smell the water in the cattle tank, to imagine I was a fin on the windmill, a splinter on the fence post, holding the gate. Parmenides again, really short one. All is full at once of light and hidden night. All is full at once of light and hidden night. Wow. So another prose poem. You open to another prose poem, a little longer one. This one begins. The poem actually came to me as I was back in those days. I wrote with a fountain pen, and I loved fountain pens. And back in those days, Jeremy used to buy me fountain pens. So this one's for you, Jeremy. It's called Ink and Sin. This morning, I sit down with my new fountain pen, fill it carefully from the reservoir at the side of the bottle, slowly replace the lid and screw it tight. Then I begin to write across the empty page. So smooth, this indelible black ink flows into words. And so smooth, my memory slides back to when I was little, and Grandma wrote letters back home to Missouri. With fountain pens that filled from ink bottles I loved to touch, to watch the dark body of ink sway inside the smooth glass walls with the slightest wobble. Each tilt aroused the sly fear of a spill I knew would make an indelible mark across her desk, her paper, the carpet, someplace everyone would see, like sin, as I was taught by my mother and the Lutherans. Grandma wasn't a Lutheran, but she had a face that could fire up a fear just like the image of hell that floated through the church pews Sunday mornings. I'd sit quiet in church, watching my mother's face go stone still, hard in the eyes, harder than the wooden pew that squeaked with a subtle yawn, or a slow turn of the head, straining to see what the men were doing on the benches at the back. Crows gone to sleep along a limb where no wind blew. Heads tilting at angles of repose. Shirt pockets bulging with packs of cigarettes I knew they'd light up as soon as they walked outside, at the end of all the talk from the pulpit about fire and sin and the Savior's hands receiving the awful nails for us, always for us. At my grandma's desk, I'd weigh the odds, take a careful twist to test how tight the lid was closed, then tilt the bottle slightly to watch the black body of ink climb one side, then the other, leaving for moments a thin veil of itself clinging to the inside walls of the darkened glass. Wasn't it trying to leave this glassy prison, waiting to be drawn into the small barrel of the green or the red pen, waiting to become a letter of the alphabet, a word in one of Grandma's sentences, then to dry and lie still across the crisp white paper from her thick tablet and be folded inside an envelope with a 3-cent stamp? She'd send me off to the post office, across the street at the end of her block, then across the other street to the red brick building with U.S. Post Office etched in the stone lintel over the door. Once inside, another world shone off the murals of Frederick Remington, off the shiny marble floor, and off the walls where wanted posters showed tough faces of people I knew had sinned. Spilled blood maybe, like ink across someone's shirt. And now their face was on the wall for all to see. I'd shiver at the thought that my face could appear there. Hold my breath as I slid past the bulletin board and over to the mail slot, where I'd read 3 times to make sure it was the one Grandma had shown me, where letters were supposed to go. Finally, I'd let it fall from my hand, wondering if I'd done it right. When I was sure I'd done nothing wrong, my mind would fly off into its wondering about that ink, now stilled onto one of Grandma's letters, with its job of saying something to someone far off in Missouri, who I'd never met, but knew was waiting to hear how we were doing. I longed for a job so clear, so clean, so done now, that no sin could happen by mistake by my hand or mind, which still moved like the ink in the bottle. and anything was waiting to happen in this world where a sin could put your face on one of those posters forever. Thank you. Thank you. Go for a couple more?
Yes.
Yeah?
Right on.
So this is the reply to that one, okay? It's called The Lutheran Overcoming the Doctrine of Original Sin. No was what I heard. Tucked it into my shirt pocket, the one on the left, and walked into the rest of my life. Worn with years, that pocket finally frayed and opened, spilled all it held onto the ground. To my surprise, from a nearby tree, something clear spoke. I barely heard. Its feathers brushed against my skin. When my hands opened, the world started over. Yes was almost its name. So, another little piece of Parmenides. It is one to me from what place I begin, for to that place I come back again. And here's the title poem called Having Listened. Trees were seldom, sunlight plentiful. I roamed there among fence posts that cut the light. Each thin shadow spoke the day west to east, trusted night, then reached again. Any creature rising up offered its tongue of dark, the hawk's quick fragment, prairie dog's short poem, buffalo and epic. So some of you know my son Soren back there is now studying philosophy, doing graduate work at Stony Brook. So Soren, this one's for you. My son's philosophy books. Sitting next to my son's books, I feel their heft and the heat inside them. So many words trying for exactly what we want to say. If books were easy, we would never burn them. My father's words were few, but he had 1,000 ways to curse the Russian thistles. They grew big and round when nothing else would. Dried and broken loose in autumn, they rolled with the wind against the nearest fence. The thistles always won. Some years we burned them, a fierce and fast fire. My father ran from pile to pile, a heap of flaming thistles on the end of his pitchfork. I ran beside him, flames crackling in my ear. Someplace among the burning, I felt he loved me. Someplace beside these books, I feel the words catch fire. My son's eyes begin to glow. If love was easy, we'd forget how to burn thistles. Here's a really short one for you again, Soren. It's called Philosopher. Words keep falling out of his chest, tumbling as birds from a nest who find their wings, feather the tattered sky. So, one more? Should we go one more? First I'll give you the Parmenides piece that comes before it. I need more water. It is not right that being be unlimited, for it is not in need. If it were, it would need everything. So the last poem I'll close with, this one is called My Blue Shirt. This is one of those poems where the title is the first line of the poem. My blue shirt hangs in the closet of this small room, collar open, sleeves empty, tail wrinkled. Nothing fills the shirt but air and my faint scent. It waits, all 7 buttons undone, buttonholes slack, the soft fabric with its square white pattern, all of it waiting for a body. It would take any body, though it knows, in its shirt way of knowing, only mine. Has my shape in its wrinkles, my bend in the elbows. Outside this room, birds hunt for food. Young leaves drink in morning sunlight. People pass on their way to breakfast. Yet here, in this closet, the blue shirt needs nothing, expects nothing, knows only its shirt knowledge that I am now learning. How to be private and patient. How to be unbuttoned. How to carry the scent of what has worn me and to know myself by the wrinkles. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for that wonderful listening that you just gave to me. Thank you so much for that. And thanks for coming. And I'm happy to sign books if you'd like. And the books are for sale over at this table if you don't already know that. Hi.